Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're decoding a seriously grim but absolutely fascinating dark fable known as the Liturgy of the Ancestral Vault. Now, on the surface, this text reads a lot like a Gothic fantasy, but as we're going to see today, it's actually a profound psychological and sociological map of systemic repression. We'll be diving deep into how societies and institutions exert control, using some incredibly striking architectural metaphors. So let's jump right into this dark liturgy and uncover the secrets it holds about the structures we build to silence dissent.
Okay, we kick things off exactly where the story begins, with a massive, suffocating dissent. We're traveling alongside two figures, the High Priest and the High Inquisitor, as they plunge into what the text calls the skeletal belly of the earth. The author paints such a vivid picture here, doesn't he? Notice how the air isn't just stale, it's a thick soup of ancient dust and bitter fertilizer. The environment itself feels completely hostile. It's meant to nourish something ancient and twisted, rather than anything new or vibrant.
Section 1. Descent into the skeletal belly. So this physical plunge away from the bright, distracting festival lights of the surface world, it's a direct mirror for a much darker psychological descent. It's literally the journey into the hidden, repressed depths where high society actively tries to bury its uncomfortable, flawed foundations. The text brilliantly maps this physical space right onto human psychology. On one hand, you have the damp catacombs and ancestral vaults, these cold, heavy, unyielding stone structures. But on the other hand, we see exactly what this represents, the inescapable, trapped reality of a repressed, unconscious mind. The physical layout of the skeletal belly mirrors the architecture of a trapped psyche. The heavy air, the dark corridors, the walls literally closing in, they perfectly simulate the experience of a mind that's been systematically boxed in and denied the oxygen of free thought.
Right, so who exactly are they dragging down into this psychological prison? Well, the High Inquisitor notes they're moving through the debris of history to settle an ultimate grudge against a figure known as the Jester Knight. And the Jester Knight is a huge symbol here. His echoing bells represent this dangerous, mocking refusal to just let the world stay small. He's the protester, the visionary, the dissenter. He's the guy pointing out that the kingdom's foundations are rotting, and for that ultimate crime of awareness, he's being dragged into the dark.
Section 2. Freud and the Repressed Mind.
To really grasp the psychological surgery happening in this subterranean operating theater, we have to pull back the curtain and look at Sigmund Freud's theories, specifically around the repression of the unconscious mind. Moving away from the bright, carnival streets above symbolizes violently stripping away the conscious persona, that everyday mask we all wear in society. By dragging the dissenter down into the dark, the architects of this system are forcing a grueling confrontation with the repressed ego and the superego. Think of it as psychological warfare. They're bypassing the victim's outward defenses and breaking them down by forcing them into the absolute darkest, most traumatic corners of the human mind.
And this leads us to a completely terrifying mechanism of control. The High Priest chillingly explains that these thorns of the past literally manifest as a physical weight against the lungs. I mean, what does that actually mean? It means that historical prejudices, systemic biases, generational traumas, they aren't just abstract ideas. When they're left unexamined and actively cultivated by the people in power, they become a literal suffocating cage. The dissenter genuinely cannot breathe because the weight of the kingdom's uncorrected history is just crushing their vitality.
So the really crucial point is how they handle the dissenter's morality and ambition. By dragging what the priest calls the bloated superego down into the catacombs to face its own repressed history, the architects achieve total paralysis. Your superego is your moral compass, right? It's your idealized self. By overwhelming it with the crushing, inescapable reality of the world's dark history, they ensure that any heroic silhouette is totally immobilized. They essentially convince the hero that fighting for a better world is a tragic, pointless joke, because the foundation is already rotten to the core.
Section 3. Architectures of social control.
Okay, let's pivot from a psychological framework to a sociological one. Because beyond psychoanalysis, the physical elements of this architecture of fear act as a literal blueprint for real-world historical methods of silencing dissent and protest. If we decode these architectural metaphors, a chillingly familiar picture starts to emerge. The heavy masonry in the vault? That represents societal compartmentalization. Think historical segregation, redlining, or rigid class structures. The twisted roots and bitter fertilizer signify the historical trauma used to feed the status quo. And those walls of exclusion are the institutional barriers literally designed to wall in the poison of dissent, keeping marginalized voices far away from the halls of power. It's a perfect, terrifying mapping of fantasy architecture to very real human systems of control.
And the craziest part? All of this is built on what the text calls the stained blueprints. These blueprints are hidden way beneath the surface's gold leaf, and they represent the messy, highly discriminatory designs that high society desperately tries to ignore, but relies on entirely to keep its power. The people walking the carnival streets above, they really don't want to think about the stained blueprints affording them their comfort. But the high priest knows the truth. The entire kingdom's stability relies on keeping those discriminatory foundations intact and totally unchallenged.
Section 4. Achieving the stone silence.
So, with the dreamer totally trapped in the catacombs, psychologically broken, and the structural barriers locked in place, the high priest kicks off this terrifying ritual. The goal isn't just punishment anymore, it is the permanent extinction of the threat. They pull this off through a twisted three-step process called the alchemical inversion. First, they confiscate the victim's creative spark and fire of imagination. Second, they methodically melt that spark down, not into heroic steel, mind you, but into cold iron shackles. Finally, they take the individual's vibrant branch of potential and graft it directly onto the twisted roots of the system. Basically, they don't just destroy the revolutionary's energy, they hijack it, weaponize it against them, and use it to feed the exact same system the revolutionary was trying to dismantle.
This right here brilliantly illustrates the horrifying genius of the whole system. The High Inquisitor ruthlessly points out the perverted mastery of this process. You don't just crush someone's hope, you actively use their dreams of the world as it could be to anchor the world as it is. You convince them that the only way to survive, or the only practical way to use their intelligence, is to manage the very systems of oppression they used to hate. You turn the rebel into the bureaucrat. You turn the jester knight into just another brick in the wall.
To finalize the whole thing, we have the Shadow Knight stepping in to execute the darkest masonry. He's wielding this hidden trowel, which is this sinister symbol of invisible structural permanence, and he's piling up the heavy masonry according to the jagged lines of a venomous grudge. The text makes a really profound distinction here. The goal of this architecture is absolutely not to build a palace of human achievement. The goal is to finish a permanent tomb around the dreamer's potential, making absolutely sure they can never rise again.
And so this dark liturgy wraps up with the ultimate goal: stone silence. It is this chilling, final state where the flickering light of ambition is completely extinguished. The rough sketch of a different, better world that the Jester Knight held on to is successfully and entirely buried beneath the heavy, repressed masonry of the kingdom's history. The architecture of fear stands firm, and the soul that actually dared to reach for the sky is successfully immobilized. They've become just another part of the masonry.
Look, the liturgy of the ancestral vault is definitely a dark, uncomfortable fable, but its allegorical power, it's completely undeniable. It perfectly maps how our own psychology and societal structures can be weaponized to maintain a stagnant status quo. So as we leave the skeletal belly behind and head back up to the surface, we really have to look around our own world and ask ourselves, what stained blueprints or heavy masonry might be quietly bearing the potential of our own society today? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking those hard questions, and I'll see you next time.